Hello and welcome to another episode of GeoStance. Today with us we have Zorawar Daulet Singh. Thank you for being on the show, Zorawar.
Thank you, Sonam. Thank you. Very happy to be on your channel.
Okay. So for the viewers' consideration, I want to introduce you. Zorawar is an author and foreign affairs analyst based in New Delhi. He holds a PhD in international relations from King's College London. For the past 15 years, he's been a commentator and columnist on India's foreign policy and its role in world order, diplomatic history, and various dimensions of India-China relations. So, Robert, I want to start with India's foreign policy and various factors which have guided it in the past few years. In the light of a nationalistic government at the helm in New Delhi, and a government which at least seems to have or adopt a more muscular foreign policy compared to previous governments, what do you think are the primary factors or influences that are guiding the current diplomatic strategies that India is adopting? And are there also domestic factors at play? And is this policy sustainable in the long run?
So these are very, very big questions. I mean, we could each of those could go on for hours, if not days. So maybe I think maybe I would start by addressing that by saying that there are certain core precepts or fundamentals that how India views the world. And in that sense, there has been a large measure of continuity. What are those basic features? I think that India wants to be this independent, rising power. It wants to be, as much as it can, in charge of its own destiny, how it governs itself internally, the type of security policies that it wants to pursue, even what it would like international institutions to, the way they formulate different issues and evolve and address global subjects and topics. So I think on that sense, India since the very beginning of, at least we're talking of this modern post-47 India, has carried on like that. I think what you were suggesting is there is this impression that since 2014, there has been a radical break or shift. I think a lot of that, if I be very candid, has a lot to do with just the discourse and the presentation of what is obviously a new political formation that has come into being in India. They are trying to sort of present themselves as something novel. They want as a sharp break from the past. It's natural in some sense. They want to create their own independent worldview and identity. It's actually very interesting. Maybe this is slightly sort of broadening what we're going. Even as they've tried to create this independent identity, there is a tension with, like I said, these core fundamentals: India's geopolitical situation, its neighborhood, the kinds of powers around it, even in the global order. There's so many aspects that are, in a sense, compelling even this government, which proclaimed it will create something totally new, to also adopt certain core fundamentals and, like I said, these precepts, which is actually nothing wrong with it. And they themselves, maybe the articulation and the rhetoric might have a certain individuality and a difference, which is natural, right? Because after all, it's a democracy. And when you have different political parties, each one has to come in and present its case in a vocabulary that appeals to its core audience, etc. So nationalism is there, and but there's also a lot of internationalism, right? So we've seen enormous amounts of engagement right from 2014, and in the second phase of the government, right up to almost 10 years now, where you've deepened ties with all the major powers. You're actively engaged in international institutions with the global south, with Asia, with the global economy. So I actually see this more in terms of the structural changes. So I think India, in a sense, is now in a phase where what we would call this idea of a multipolar world is now unfolding in front of us. And it's I think this government and Indians in general see this as something which is a positive development, because it is breaking the monopoly of the West, which has held on to an unusually strong position over all aspects of international life for nearly 400-500 years. So the breaking of that monopoly has given India space along with many others, and it is embracing this new phase that's coming in. Of course, everything is not perfect, because it can't be done alone. Many other players have to come in and in a sense shake up this global order and make it reflect something which is more democratized, more plural, more diverse, so that civilizations like India have a space in this next phase, which could last for a very, very long time. But because we're at that tipping point, it can go either way, in terms of we're seeing a lot of conflicts. We are seeing many issues that have very, very divisive kind of, I'm talking at the international order level. So India is kind of even watching and seeing where things are going, but it's kind of still sticking to its core fundamentals, which is, I would argue, a positive development, because making geopolitical mistakes can often, as we've seen in the past, can really tend to disrupt a state's rise, push it into a corner, make it make choices which it shouldn't be making, and undermine even domestic stability. So I think on the whole, India is kind of moving in a direction where it's kept its options open. And yeah, that's a sort of a long-winded uh, answer to some of the themes that I think you wanted to touch upon.
Right. So, since you mentioned that the West has primarily been dominating the space for hundreds of years now, how did this world order, or rather disorder, come into being? How was it? I mean, how is that it's always been this way?
So we of course have to then go back into a much deeper history. The If we look at the longer span of maybe the last millennia or 2 millennia, we know now in terms of the kind of, if we look at the empirical facts, Asia was always a very large part of that global order in terms of economic wealth, power. It was only this phase of maybe the which we look back to the late 16th, 17th century, where European kind of, I mean, in fact, this is the big question. What you asked really is that why did Asia fall behind, and why did the West rise? And this debate is actually carried on, and it's only in the 1980s, 1990s, as India, China, and others were beginning to reclaim some of their older economic sort of strength, that the old arguments of, that the West was always predisposed to be at this level and everyone had to follow their model. I think now we are beginning to see that this was a temporary blip, and obviously colonization happened, and Asia fell behind, and it's this reversal of Western preponderance has been happening over the last 100 years, especially since the 40s and 50s, as the two major powers of Asia, which is India, China, have kind of now stepping back and standing up on their feet. So now we have reached the phase of not complete, of course, reversal of that. The West is still very, very strong. As we know, they move together, even at the cost of submitting their own sovereignty and autonomy of these individual components of this Western community into, let's say, the uh, uh, leading state. So it's a long way to go for that balance to come at a cultural level, at an ideation level. But a lot of it is happened. Uh, so and I feel a lot of that sort of this the breaking of the Western hegemony has also happened because the West kind of also, and this is not a new argument, I think it misused the moment that it had after the Cold War ended. It had an enormous footprint over how it could change the texture of world order in the 1990s. And I think it squandered that moment. As we know, we look back to all these conflicts, as you, of course, seen Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan. I mean, there were a whole range of actions that the West took that that in fact just made the non-West look that these guys are just after pure power, and this idea of projecting values and ideas which are universal is actually a fig leaf for ultimately their narrow, selfish geopolitical and economic interests. So as that illusion kind of was exposed to the non-West, now they are sort of unabashedly moving forward, and they're not going to buy into those kind of fragile arguments. They're making their case strong, and as their power, the material power to back up grows, their economy and their militaries, they can negotiate this new world order as it continues to evolve over the next 10, 15, 20 years, which is a process.
Hmm. So, how does India navigate its relationship with China in the light of its strengthening ties with the US in the recent years? I mean, of course, our alliance goes back to late 2000s, but in the recent years, we've come a long way, right? India and the US. So, how do we manage this relationship? Because if you look at the Chinese media, they seem to suggest that uh, the collective might of military might of India and the US also cannot really do anything to create a deterrence for China vis-a-vis its expansionist designs when it comes to India. So, is the collective might of the US and India acting as a deterrence, or rather fueling the expansionist designs of China vis-a-vis India?
So when it comes to China, India is kind of operating in two realms. At one, it of course has to manage the impact of a rising China when it affects Indian interests, which, as we know, on the border, in the region, on the economy, and many areas. And part of that response of India to manage this is an attempt to develop a strong relationship with the United States and the Western powers to sort of manage China. But as you suggested, the reason why it hasn't fully been able to create the kind of deterrent effects is because the West does not look at India's concerns as its concerns. For its own broader international goals, China is of course a major challenge, but it has also a very deep interlink with the Chinese economy. It's even its security problems with China are nothing to do with India's. It's in East Asia, it's in the Western Pacific, it's in Taiwan and Japan and all the other arenas where India is very far away from those areas. So that is what has complicated India's kind of, let's say, call it a geo strategy, if it is that. I think Indian policymakers recognize that this is not so straightforward, that you just develop a strong security partnership with America and your China problem will just be solved. So a lot of it has to do with how India develops internally, how the Indian economy continues to grow and broaden and diversify into a qualitative kind of modernization in industry, manufacturing, technology, innovation. And of course, then much of that will also reflect in a more capable military strength and a political presence in the Indian subcontinent and the broader region. So as those aspects of India continue to evolve, which is a function of time and skill and the commitment of the policy making community, we will tend to see China then responding to that. At the moment, uh, if, they are beginning to see the US factor is not really enough to rethink how it would like to deal with India. So this is a work in progress in a way. And but at the same time, we've seen Indian policymakers have been quite pragmatic, even after the 2020 crisis in Ladakh, where they have uh, held on to their positions. They've not compromised in many ways, but at the same time, they have been careful not to escalate and let this conflict erupt, which will be, of course, very bad for India and very bad for China. So they are being sensible in a sense. and how they manage this. They would, of course, both sides, if they were to come to some understanding and on the border issue. In fact, we saw the foreign minister very recently say that it's in their common interest of both countries to sort of manage this and not let it sort of erupt into uh, uh, even more tensions. And so we're seeing that unfold. But at the same time, India is also being quite pragmatic and not
Hmm.
losing sight of its long range goals on world order. Right? It needs the
Hmm.
non-Western states to also play an important role in the very changing of the international institutions. So I'm talking of BRICS, for example.
Hmm.
You've seen India and China uh, come together and help a lot of other non-Western powers from the global south to access these institutions. That would not be possible if India had kind of been waging this single unidimensional kind of a, let's say, a cold war with China. So it's kind of treating many different aspects of the China relationship and dealing with each of them on those specific terms that it needs to respond to. So again, we are seeing that's a sign of maturity in some ways, even though it irritates some of our Western partners that why is India doing this, but that's something which is good for India's own national interests and world order goals as well.
Right. So you do not agree with this assertion that India has lost its strategic autonomy to some degree in the recent years, because the Chinese believe that we are sitting in America's lap. There is also this concern emerging out of Moscow. And the Americans also have this problem with India that you eventually will have to choose a camp. To what extent do you think India can avoid choosing a camp? Because now, when you're playing a game where you have higher stakes, right? You got to lose some, you got to gain some. So, how do we navigate this challenge? Can we continue to be adopting a policy of non-alignment, which according to me, I mean, we've had some shift from that, but then you seem to suggest that we are still walking the same path. So, how do you see the future of it all?
So it's funny that both sides of this sort of global divide that's come up are saying that India can't sustain this. That it has to make a choice. It has to. But I think the folks that are really were urging India to make a choice, it was more the Western community really, because the non-West understands that this is quite normal for states to have sort of diverse relationships, and it doesn't have to be like an all or nothing kind of a black and white game. So, uh, but yes, it's true that the Chinese have kind of also put this impression that India is completely in the US camp, and which India, through its own actions, I think has demonstrated that it's not, right. It is on Ukraine and on so many other issues, even when it comes to its own economic security, its own political stability, and its own governance, its own region. There are many areas where India has demonstrated that it is moving along on how it sees the region and the world. So that's ultimately it's. I think people are seeing reality, and even the West now is beginning to sort of understand that there was that. If you recall, after the Ukraine conflict, when it just began, there was intense pressure on India to kind of curtail ties with Moscow, cut back on the economy, not buy Russian energy resources, etc. And but we saw that kind of the Indian resolve was not sort of shaken by that, and they continued to move in a direction which was deemed to be the right choice. And I think it's vindicated now. We've seen the Ukraine crisis is now seen as more a miscalculation of NATO and the West, and the global South, non-West has kind of taken this neutral position and does not want to sort of get involved in something which was anyway a very, very dangerous sort of escalation that has its own history, of course. So I think to come back to your basic theme is that these kind of questions that will India may have to be forced to make a choice. These go back to the 50s, in fact, where they said non-alignment is irrational, it cannot sustain. So today, this idea of multi-alignment or a multi-vector foreign policy, which the foreign minister used the term they continue to say that, at some stage it's going to all collapse and fall apart. But we've seen that through sensible statecraft, managing your competitive relationships and your partnerships, you are able to play this role and maintain your forward journey to an independent sort of rising great power, which is, or at some stage you want to emerge as that. So there is no other way. If you want to go there, this is the only pathway. The pathway cannot come from sort of joining a camp, because then you all, it's over, right? Then that's a very different role of what, let's say, Japan or Germany or France or the UK play, that, or Australia. That's not what India seeks for itself. So it's a very distinct path, but it's quite recognizable to the entire non-West. It only doesn't make sense to the Western powers, who themselves have given up their sovereignty and autonomy to one single actor.
True, true. So this leads to another question, which is pretty much, themed around the last question. While the West keeps rushing high-level delegations to China, which you could call it desperation also on their part, that is how it seems. When India talks about normalizing relationship with China or continuing is business as usual on the commercial front, on the trade front, the West seems to suggest that we are being very idealistic here and eventually we will have to get into a conflict. So why does the West have two different yardsticks when it comes to managing its own strategic relationship or trade relationship with China, but it's not ready to extend the same courtesy to India when it comes to managing its own differences with China?
Yeah. So I think the reason for this, of course, we've already, in a sense, alluded to. The idea in the Western strategic mind that there could be other independent great powers doing their own thing is anathema. It does not exist in their mind. So it's like, if it exists, which is why this whole history of the Cold War era, there was the East, there was the West, and this whole middle space was not even treated as these guys. I mean, this doesn't make sense ideologically. And so today, that same aspect, but ultimately, it's about also to India for it to make its stand known, and which it's doing that. So the West has to be forced, in a sense, to recognize the reality that this is where India is going to go. It's distinct from the West. It's also may have some common features with the East, which are all collectively retaining their old space in the international scene, but it has its own domestic political system, its own civilizational heritage, its own geography, which in a sense shapes that it will move in a journey on its own. So that's the kind of trend lines we're seeing. But it's true, as you said, that the West, when it comes to its very, very critical security problems with China or its massive economic relationship, it can be quite constructive, even though there is, of course, a very big discourse inside the West, particularly in the United States, that wants to politicize and in a sense prevent the flexibility that the White House at any particular time would want to have in managing the China policy. But we've seen that despite that domestic kind of this discourse, the central policymakers have not lost control to the forces of, you could say, nationalism, etc. So they've retained that control, which is which we can expect, right, from a major power. The idea that you just submit yourself to populism and public sort of, which you have yourself in a sense created. I mean, that's normal, right? The Chinese also do it, where they use nationalism when they need to on certain issues, but they can rein it in when they want to pursue cooperation. So it's quite normal. India is doing it too, in a sense. Like we began this entire conversation by saying this idea of a muscular nationalist foreign policy, but that's not stopped India from being very flexible and subtle and even contradictory at times, right? So that's quite normal in a way.
Why won't the West adopt a reconciliatory approach when it comes to dealing with Russia? I mean, wouldn't it make sense for the US also to kind of move to a softer stance vis-a-vis Russia, that would also offload a lot of burden on some of its allies, which are already screaming. You talk about Germany, you talk about France. They are all are now trying to build their own armies up, especially after the debacle in Afghanistan. Many of US's allies today, historical allies, they do not really trust the US as much when it comes to handling their security. Why doesn't US adopt a softer approach towards Russia when the Russians are time and again saying that we are not interested in expanding? And in fact, if it was not for the NATO to come and sit right next to us in Ukraine, we wouldn't even get into a war with Ukraine. And why doesn't US try to put an end to this war?
So this is, in fact, the Western, especially the Anglo-American outlook towards Russia, actually has a very, very long history of, a very hostile approach to this power in Eurasia, which kind of was never, it was Western, but it was never really a part of that sphere. So it's this idea of Russian containment actually goes back to centuries, and you've had a series of attempts, as you of course will recall, right from Northern Europe to France to Germany to now NATO, attempting to sort of push back and in a sense weaken, if not completely dismantle this old historic power in the heart of Eurasia. So it sees from the Western point of view, it it is now it's like a natural policy that they've been following. It hasn't succeeded, but they've locked into this confrontation. And of course, now with nuclear weapons in the last 70 years, which is why we had the Cold War. There was never really a direct collision between NATO and the Soviet bloc, and but now we're coming even closer to this kind of direct collision. So it's, I think, that old game of Russian containment. They just can't give it up, and the only way they will be forced to come to terms is that for Russia to prevail on the battlefield and set the terms of a new European security architecture, which is what's happening, and tragically at the cost of millions of casualties, or hundreds of thousands on all sides, and an economic landscape even in Europe suffering because of this. So this is an ideological crusade by the West, and at least the way I see it, and many in the non-West would see that. And for Russia, it's a fight for survival, in a sense. Survival, not necessarily that the state is coming to an end, but this was seen as the last stepping stone, because then you like literally have touched the Russian borders. So this is like become now almost a crusade from all sides, and which is which is why it's so dangerous. And because, but I think it seems that the Russian resolve on this conflict is a bit more than the West. It's ability to absorb costs, ability to go all the way, and eventually it will prevail. The question is, like you said, the West would be better off with some kind of an understanding of a new European security architecture, because after all, the post-Cold War architecture of NATO is the only anchor of European security that has now been challenged in the last 10 years, 15 years by Russia, and this even more so now. So what the Russians are saying, let there be now two major powers, which is the United States and Russia, come to a new understanding of security in the European continent. It can't just be NATO. So that is the source of this. And it's also manifesting at the global level, because both these countries account for the overwhelming military power, the nuclear power on this planet. So it has repercussions on global security as well. So I think you were right to suggest that from an Indian point of view, of course, we would like America and the West to have a more sort of a balanced and a broader footprint to respond to all the other challenges that the world's facing. But I think that ideological crusade is kind of reached this crescendo, and is the only way is not going to happen through just persuasion. And it's that which is why we're seeing a hard military contest, and it ultimately the outcome of this Ukraine conflict will dictate what European security and global security will look like.
What do you think are the prospects of India um, resolving its disputes with China. There have been some tensions recently. We've also sent reinforcements along our border with China. Some would say that this is business as usual. This is just India bolstering its defense. Can you make a sense of it all for us? And tell us, what do you think are the prospects of this getting resolved, given the historical tensions and also the lack of progress in military level talks?
So it's going to be, if you are asking, can it be resolved at the entire dispute be settled, and we can come to an understanding of what will be the final map of India and the final map of China. I think there we are quite far away from that. Although you just never know the way international situation evolves over, let's say, the next 5, 10, 15 years. But from a conflict management point of view, to keep the frontier stable, even though it's now highly militarized, as we know, there's several 100,000 troops which were not there 5 years ago. So there is a lot of active presence on both sides, which is why you are seeing now the political leaderships on both sides, even in India, being very, very conscious in how to manage. Because after all, you both sides are riding a tiger, and you have to sort of now not let it escalate. So in that sense, I think both countries, we don't see any indication that they have lost sense of the proportion of the dispute. So there is a dispute, but it's not at this stage. We don't see any signs for it to escalate at that level. But that doesn't mean that either side should get complacent and not continue to try and pursue some kind of confidence building measures incrementally to freeze things. I'm talking of the the military kind of balance at a level which allows both sides to have security, but at a more calmer level. And so, but but I think eventually we do keep coming back to this question that will the Indians and the Chinese, because the dispute itself goes back to even the British period, right? In 19th century, where you had a weakening China and a British in India, and all these frontier areas kind of go back a long, long way. So in some sense, both these countries have inherited a problem and they haven't managed it well. Although some could argue that they have not let conflict, apart from the 62 war, which was a very tragic event and a very reckless uh, aggression by the Chinese. Other than that, I think both sides have not let this conflict truly sort of explode over 70, 75 years. So the Ladakh crisis is a test for this government on both sides to see that can this be just another episode in an otherwise more or less a stable but disputed frontier. So that's the challenge for India and for China, that will this episode be recalled, let's say in 20, 30 years, as okay, that they came close, but they did not go beyond the brink, so to speak.
Hmm. This is my last question to you. Why do we not see conversations like what the two of us are having right now on the mainstream Indian media? I see a lot of complaints, even in the comment section of my own blogs, that we want to know more about what is happening on, the Chinese front, but we rather see the mainstream media being dominated by Pakistan, which, if you ask strategic thinkers or even the babus in New Delhi, they would say it's a case which is done and dusted. We would rather sit at a distance and watch the fall of Pakistan. But our mainstream media seems to be still dominated by the rhetoric. They're not doing much when it comes to shaping up healthy discourse, also, you know, uh, being a promoter of India's, uh, what do you say, soft power, or for that matter, even the hard power. Why do we see our media not doing what could be seen as a step in the right direction?
So this is an important question, right? How can such a major developing economy and a major rising power not even have the ability to project its worldview through its own information networks? And in fact, the mainstream media in India is sadly like become an entertainment kind of avenue, right? It's not serious at all. So, but here the failure has to eventually be placed at the door of the state and of the governments of the day, of not reinvesting enough in the public broadcasters, right? After a while, they are the sort of the vanguards of the idea to at least have these debates. I think to some extent it does happen in our public broadcasters, but not enough. I think there's definitely a case to be made that the way the America has CNN, the British has BBC, Russia has RT, Chinese have CGTN, whereas India's global channel, uh, of course, it has to be state funded. It can have many actors brought into that tent, but that public investment and commitment to say that this is how we are going to project ourselves on the global stage, whatever that those ideas may be, and as plural and diverse, which they inevitably will be, that failure has to be placed at the door of state. That why isn't it done that? And I think we don't have enough of an answer of what we are seeing is partly what is saving this situation is, though it's not enough, is like you said, that the democratization of the information space through social media and other platforms is now allowing lots of conversations to organically happen, which are not sort of mediated by either a major corporate player or the state or any particular agenda. So those are allowing Indians now to participate in the conversation on these subjects and areas of strategy, of geopolitics, of foreign policy, of world order. Though it's barely, we are just scratching the surface in a sense that we need much, much more of this. But I think uh, just the nature of the evolution of digital platforms and digital media, which allows even small scale actors to participate in this process, makes the idea of now these conversations becoming reaching out to much more bigger and wider audiences. But ultimately, it can't substitute the idea of having these bigger platforms where you are having big debates, the big questions of the time, and it's reaching not just an Indian audience but global audiences in multiple languages. So that's a huge sort of area where India needs to work on.
Thank you. I'm done for the day. Do you have any concluding remarks?
Oh, thank you, Sonam. I think we hope to reach your interesting and wide growing audience, and hopefully their engagement with these themes will allow us to keep moving forward and getting more and more sort of voices to engage themes that are, like you said, not at all being addressed in the public square, so to speak.
G. On that note, I thank you once again for being on GeoStance today. It was such a privilege having you, and I look forward to speaking to you again and very soon. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you.